Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. My name is Caitlin Saladino. I'm the Director of Strategic Development here at Brookings Mountain West. And on behalf of my colleagues, Bill Brown, Ashley LeClaire, our Executive Director, Dave DeMoore, and our entire student research team, I want to thank you for coming out for our first lecture in the Spring 2024 Brookings Scholar Lecture Series. So thanks for helping us kick this off tonight. I also want to take a brief moment to acknowledge our donors to Brookings Mountain West. Their support, of course, allows us to do the kinds of events that we're doing tonight, and we appreciate it greatly. Also want to take a minute, of course, to thank our team at UNLV TV, who is helping to record this lecture. In a few days, this will be available on our website, so you can share this widely with your colleagues and friends, as well as the slides from tonight. So no worries about writing everything down that you may see. It will all be available on our website soon enough. Like all our visiting scholars, Elaine Kamarck is here from the Brookings Institution. We're really excited to finally welcome her here. A little bit of context. Elaine was originally going to visit us in 2020 during that presidential election cycle, but we know how the world sort of ended up then. It didn't happen, but we have sort of impatiently been waiting for the opportunity to bring her out here, and we're thrilled that she's able to speak on behalf of our latest presidential election cycle here in 2024. So like all our scholars, Elaine's been meeting with UNLV faculty and students, teaching in classes, meeting with university administration. She'll meet with leadership from the state of Nevada tomorrow, and we've just been giving her an opportunity to learn a little bit more about our metro and our home. So a little bit about Elaine's background before we bring her up. Elaine joins us from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., where she's a senior fellow in governance studies and the founding director of the Center for Effective Public Management there. She's an expert on American electoral politics, government, innovation, and reform, and much of her research, of course, focuses on the presidential nomination system and American politics. In addition to her work at Brookings, Elaine has held many roles, including senior policy advisor to several American presidential campaigns. She has participated actively in 4 presidential campaigns and in 10 nominating conventions, including 2 Republican conventions, and has served as a superdelegate to 5 Democratic conventions. Elaine has been a member of the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, and the DNC's Rules Committee since 1997. Elaine is also a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and she holds a doctorate in political science from UC Berkeley. As always, we'll reserve a bit of time after her talk today to open up to audience Q&A. So if you want to jot those down as she's speaking and reserve them for the end, we'd appreciate it. And without further ado, I want to ask you to help me welcome Elaine up to the stage.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me out here, okay? I want to talk today about a topic that always comes up every 4 years, which is people look at the nomination system and they say, where'd this come from, right? Isn't there a better way to do this? But for us to understand if there's a better way, we need to look at how we got here to begin with. So I'm going to start with a really fast history of the presidential nomination process, throw out a couple ideas that are always around for changing it, and then open it up to questions and discussions, okay? So we start, of course, with George Washington, right? There was no question of how to nominate a president when George Washington became president because he was the father of the country. Everybody agreed on him. There were no formed political parties at that point, right? And basically, George Washington had won independence from Great Britain. He was the man, no doubt about it. Of course, human beings being what they are, this, of course, changed over time. So by 1800, when Washington stepped down and they had to nominate new presidents, new presidential candidates, there were already 2 parties. They had different viewpoints, they had different regional backings, et cetera. And those 2 parties nominated their presidential candidates in the congressional caucus. Now, that meant that people who sided with, say, Jefferson, wanted Jefferson to run, people who identified with John Quincy Adams wanted him to run, John Adams, sorry, wanted him to run, et cetera. this was a very important turning point in American government, because had we persisted in using the Congressional Caucus to nominate candidates, we would not have had the government we have today. We would have had a government more like they have in Great Britain. We would have had a parliamentary government. In Great Britain, the prime minister comes out of the legislative party. Okay, in our country, that's not the case. You can have a legislative party and a presidential party that might look a little bit different. So this was a critical decision, and they decided not to continue using the Congressional Caucus after things went into a mess. I won't go into a long story, but basically Andrew Jackson was denied the White House in 1824, and by 1828, he came back, and the first thing he did is said, get rid of this thing. And so we come to the nominating convention. The nominating convention persisted from 1831 all the way until 1968. You see pictures of it here. In old movies, you might see some, enactments of an old nominating convention. What was it? Well, basically, for more than 100 years, state parties would hold caucuses and conventions in their counties, in their precincts, in their counties, in their congressional districts. And those meetings would send people to a state convention. And at the state convention, they would choose people who went to the national convention. So it's kind of a tiered approach. You started running at the grassroots level, and if you were successful, you went to the county convention, and then you went to the state convention, and then maybe if you were lucky and had enough support, you got to be a delegate to the national convention. During this long period of months when this was going on, people didn't actually declare who they wanted to be president. Now, people could guess. Insiders would say, well, that person is really for this guy, and that person's for that guy. They could sort of guess, but there was no formal declaration of presidential preference, right? It was just an organic process that went on in the states. And this actually worked pretty well, right? And this process nominated Franklin Roosevelt, nominated Jack Kennedy, it nominated Dwight D. Eisenhower. It worked pretty well for a long, long period of time. Not to say it was a perfect process. It certainly nominated some duds of presidents, some losers, et cetera. But it worked. All in all, this was the way people thought it should work. It did have its downsides, though. Obviously, women were pretty much excluded. Minorities were pretty much excluded, except that in certain places in the country, you had black political machines, African-American political machines, representing whole congressional districts, and they got to play in the game, right? So if you had a base in politics, you did get to play in the game. But by and large, by the 1960s, people were getting pretty unhappy with this mode of action. And so we come to, and this by the way, on your left, that's the boss of Tammany Hall, a picture of a famous machine. And here we have Governor Lawrence of Pennsylvania, who ran Pennsylvania with an iron hand and controlled the Democratic Party there for many years. So these were the bosses and the elected officials that existed for this period of time. And then we have 1968. Some of you in this room may remember the 1968 convention. Others who are too young, I urge you to go to YouTube history, and you can see the turmoil both inside the convention hall and outside the convention hall, the turmoil at the 68 convention, caused by the fact that Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson's vice president, was on his way to the convention, and yet during the Johnson years, opposition to the war in Vietnam had reached fever pitch. And anti-war candidates, starting with Eugene McCarthy, going to Robert Kennedy, the first one, not the one running now, had in fact entered primaries and won primaries, but guess what? they didn't win delegates. They could win primaries. In those days, you could win primaries, but you didn't have to win delegates. In fact, there were very few primaries, and most of those primaries were non-binding, or as we call it, they were beauty contests. So imagine this, right? Imagine this in today's world, right? Candidates run, they compete in a primary, somebody wins the primary, they don't get any delegates, okay? You can see that this made some people really mad, okay? And that's why not only were there riots outside the convention hall, but inside the convention hall, there were a lot of riots, there were fistfights, okay? People got hurt, both places, not as badly as they did outside, but it was a real mess. When it finally ended, the leaders of the party gave as a sort of, little bit of peacemaking to the anti-war crowd. They said, okay, guys, let's do a commission, and this commission will be chaired by George McGovern, a senator, and Mayor Fraser, mayor of Minneapolis, and they're gonna look at this whole business. And they're gonna fix it, right? So that we won't have the same kind of conventions and the same kind of ugly messes in the primary system that we had at the 1968 in Chicago. And hence was born the McGovern-Fraser Commission. Now, for those of you in the audience, one of the things you'll learn in American history is how often there are unintended consequences. No one quite knew what was happening to the nomination system. This was really, it came frankly as a surprise. But this was a pivot point. This was one of the most consequential periods in history. These guys met between 1969 and 1972, and they changed the nomination system in ways that were to be revolutionary. The big history of this book is written by a guy named Byron Schaefer, and it's called The Quiet Revolution. Because again, nobody really kind of knew what it was doing. So what did it do? Here are 6 rules that transformed the nomination process, okay? So remember, we went through a process that was the Congressional Caucus, then a long time of process of conventions, and now we're in the new world. Here's the rules that shaped the new world. First of all, the first-tier caucuses should be open to anybody who wanted to be known as a Democrat. It used to be that you had to be like the precinct chair, or you had to be a member of the precinct committee. You had to have previously won some party office to participate at all. And this said, nah, open it up. And in the words of Mo Udall, who lost the Iowa caucuses to Jimmy Carter, it turned caucuses into the functional equivalent of a primary. Because the presidential candidates then figured out, some of them, that you had to turn out lots and lots of people at that first tier. Whereas in the old days, nobody bothered to do that, right? They bothered to work with the power brokers in the state. The second thing they did is said the first-tier caucuses must be held simultaneously throughout the state. So, and that meant that once again, it becomes more like a primary. If the caucuses are held over a period of 3 or 4 weeks, as they used to be in Iowa and Minnesota, places like that, it wasn't a news item. You couldn't count who won and who lost. Once they said they have to be at the same time and the same place, well, guess what? You could turn it into a primary. There was 11 o'clock, things went into the state party held a press conference, said Jimmy Carter won. And of course, the first big win, first candidate to really win the Iowa caucuses was Jimmy Carter. The third big thing is that everybody had to declare their presidential preference. In the old days, most of the people were uncommitted, right? They didn't declare, they might have known in their heart of hearts who they liked. Other people in the state might have known, but basically you didn't have to publicly declare that. You just went, and if you had enough votes within the party, you could get elected without ever saying who you're for. And that's why in the old days, let's take 1959, okay, the year before Kennedy wins the nomination, his brother Robert, the father of the current presidential candidate, his brother Robert spent 1959 going from state convention to state convention throughout America, talking to people, talking up his brother, saying why he could win, all that stuff. That was how you campaigned. It was very quiet, very under the radar. And in fact, it's very hard. I had to do this for my book. You had to really dig into little snippets in the New York Times who would write one paragraph. They would say, you know, Bobby Kennedy was in Nevada last weekend for the state convention, and he said that he thinks things are looking good for Jack Kennedy in Nevada, right? I mean, it was just, that was all they could say. The third thing is that there was a ban on the use of the unit rule. The unit rule was used in both parties, and it said a majority of the delegation can vote to cast all the votes of that delegation for the majority. So if California comes in with its whopping big, you know, delegation of a couple hundred people, a majority could vote to cast all of California's votes for the winner in that delegation. People really didn't like that. Fourth or fifth, or I can't, I've lost count here, delegates must fairly reflect the will of the voters. That introduced proportional representation into the nominating process, okay? It said if somebody got 2/3 of the votes, they ought to get 2/3 of the delegates, pure and simple. And there's a threshold of 15% below which you can't get any delegates, but then the math was done over that. The only time in my life I ever used algebra, I never told my children this till later, was when I was about 30 and I wrote the formula that's still in the Democratic Party rules for how you allocate these delegates mathematically. And for years, I used to have to work with the networks to sort of explain this. And now, of course, they put it into a computer and they calculate the delegates just like that. So my usefulness is quickly going away. States had to use affirmative action in the delegate process. They were required to tell people about the process. It used to be that they didn't have to tell anybody. They didn't have to tell the public. This was party business. So if you weren't in the party structure, either as a lowly precinct chairman or a county committee chairman or secretary of the state committee, you know, if you weren't in, there was no obligation to tell anybody, right? Because people assumed this was the way it was. And by the way, for this 130 some years, the public assumed this was the way the world was too. I mean, there wasn't any opposition to this. They just said, yeah, parties pick the candidates. And finally, these changes reformed the Republican Party as well, which is kind of weird. The changes happened in the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party, in those days, most state legislatures were run by Democrats. So what happened is the state legislatures passed primary laws to create presidential primaries. And when they did that, they just did it for both parties. Now, as I'll get to later, the Republicans didn't have to have a state primary, but they soon learned that by having a big, great primary with lots of coverage, et cetera, guess what? They got voters. People were excited. It was much more public, and that helped them grow their voting lists, et cetera. So basically, even though the Democrats started this, the evolution of the nomination process in both parties runs along a very, very similar track. And they're very similar today. There's some differences that I'll talk about, but basically what happened is they both adopted some very monumental changes. So what happened? What are the consequences for the parties we have today? First of all, a massive increase in primaries, right? Prior to 1972, there were on average 15 or 16 primaries a year, and that was all. Secondly, and more importantly, all primaries became binding. That means that the primary mattered for the allocation of delegates, okay? You couldn't ignore the primaries. In 1952, in the Democratic Party, a senator from Tennessee ran for president, won primaries, and Adlai Stevenson was nominated at the convention, who won no primaries, okay? So that's just, it gives you an idea. And by the way, nobody fussed about it, right? I mean, this was not a big, huge issue like the superdelegates or anything like that. Nobody fussed about it because it was accepted that the party people chose the nominee, not the voters. The minute primaries become binding, and primaries dictate who gets how many delegates, then all of a sudden, power shifts early. Power shifts from the party people and the party leaders to the public. And that's a revolution. That's the big revolution. A massive shift in power from the party people and the elected officials to voters who turn out in presidential primaries. Now, the next thing that happens is that the early states increase in importance. New Hampshire has had a presidential primary in January, February, forever, okay? Only in a couple instances did anybody pay any attention to this. Iowa always had their caucuses in the dead of winter. Nobody paid much attention to them. For one thing, the caucuses were spread out over weeks, and they didn't declare presidential preference, so, you know, what could you learn from them? But what happens when there's a sequence of primaries is that a win in one state affects the voters in the next state. It's called momentum, and it is more valuable to people seeking the presidential nomination than dollars. You'd rather have momentum than actual hard, cold cash. And the reason is that it's a sequential process. So each next primary feeds on the one before it. And that is unique to presidential elections, to any election in the United States, and it's unique to any election in the world, okay? Because elections tend to happen on one day. This election starts in January and doesn't finish until June. And therefore, being first, or among the first, has a really big, important role in creating momentum. The states that weren't so lucky to be first start to push earlier and earlier. And New Hampshire, in its wisdom, has a law that says, we don't have a date for our presidential primary, but we're going to have a presidential primary that is 1 week before any similar primary in the United States. All right, so what happens? Everybody tries to jump over New Hampshire. And then people realize, well, wait a minute, this is crazy. You're going to have presidential primaries in June, right, before the election year? This is sort of nutty. This is not very good for the voters or for the party. And so the parties, the Republicans as well, adopt a rule saying that the primaries can't go earlier than the second week in March. And then that gets moved up to the first week in March. So then there becomes a fight for who gets to go before everybody else. And that fight, I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but that fight persists to this very day. And finally, what happens is that lots of states move early. They move to that first date in March because they don't want to be left out of the action. They're afraid that if their state comes in May or June, that it'll be all over, nobody will come visit them, their voters won't get a chance to have a say, their politicians won't have a sense to be brokers among the voters, you know, it's a drag. So you get everything moving into March. This year, next month, by the middle of March, probably Biden and probably Trump will have amassed enough delegates to claim a first ballot nomination at the convention. And this thing's going to be over, okay? Just because there's so many delegates awarded in March. And here's an example of the explosion. Between 1932 and 1968, all those years, you have an average of about 15 primaries a year. And then from 1972, I should have updated this to 2020 and including 2024, you have an average about 30 a year. So you double the number of primaries. Okay, so there we are. We have a system now, let me go back so we're not distracted. We have a system now that is basically run by voters who vote in primaries. There are still delegates, but you wouldn't know it, right, to look at this system, because the primaries generally happen on a certain day, and then in the weeks that follow, they actually elect the delegates. So we won't know who the 4,000 and some delegates to the Democratic Convention are until the middle of June. We won't know who the 2,000 and some delegates to the Republican Convention are until, again, the middle of June. It's a weird thing. The delegates get allocated to presidential candidates, but they're not real human beings in those roles. And remember that, because that's important as we talk about all the things that could still happen. Okay, so this brings us to the question, is there a better way? Okay, there's many different ways. They've been floated for many, many years. And let's start with one of the simplest. Why don't we have a national primary, right? Why don't we pick a date in March or April, and the Democrats have one primary and the Republicans have another primary? Okay, that's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Everybody would like that. Everybody would get to vote, right? And no matter what state you're in. A bill for national primaries has been introduced in the Congress over 100 times in the past decades. It never goes anywhere. And one of the reasons is that political parties realize that would be the final nail in the coffin. That would really take any input into that out of their hands. Secondly, states like presidential primaries. They get a lot of attention. Some states get a lot of money when the presidential candidates come through. So the states kind of like it. And it is questionable constitutionally, because this Constitution does give states preeminence when it comes to elections. So if a law like this would certainly have to undergo constitutional review and probably end up with this at the Supreme Court. Secondly, lots of plans for regional primaries, right? Why not have a mountain state primary where all the mountain states vote on the same day? And then a West Coast primary, and a Midwest primary, and a Southern primary, and Mid-Atlantic, a New England primary. And you could get fancy and you could rotate the sequence of those primaries. So one region wasn't always going first. That's been a pretty popular idea for a long time. It has sort of happened organically. You'll note on March the 5th, Super Tuesday, that there's a lot of southern states. In fact, they sometimes call it the SEC primary. And also there's a bunch of New England states that decided to get into the act on March 5th. Others have advocated, let's have primaries on only certain days and have a mix. Have a big state and a little state on the same day, an urban state and a rural state on the same day. Let's have a western state and an eastern state on the same day. You know, have sort of a bunch of microcosm primaries. The other idea out there is to rotate the early primary states. This was not very popular until this year. The Democratic Party, for the first time, the Rules Committee, which I'm on, voted to change the sequence of these early primaries and put South Carolina, not New Hampshire, first. New Hampshire is still mad about this. I'm afraid to go to New Hampshire, It's a good thing I don't go there much. Nevada is much safer. Nevada and New Hampshire second. And then in the final place is South Carolina, Nevada, New Hampshire, and then we go to Michigan and to the South Carolina, rather. South Carolina first, Nevada, New Hampshire, and then Michigan, and then Super Tuesday. That's for the Democratic side. The Republicans decided not to do that, okay? So the Republicans they stuck with New Hampshire first. And another way is to allow for party leaders and elected officials to have a greater voice, greater say in the choice of a nominee. So this brings back something that people have said was the problem with the current system. In the old system, it was too closed, right? Newcomers couldn't get in. In the new system, they argue that what we've lost is peer review. Now, what is peer review? Every profession has peer review in the United States. Your brain surgeon has peer review. He's certified by other brain surgeons that, yeah, he can crack your head open and you won't die. You don't choose a brain surgeon based on their smile or their personality. You choose your brain surgeon on their certification. Even manicurists, right, ladies, are manicurists. They have licenses. They have to get a license from the state so that they won't give you a fungus in your nail or something, right? So even manicurists, they are licensed. Their peer review is throughout the public, except when it comes to presidential candidates. In the old days, the informal peer review existed because other people who were in government, Governor Lawrence, for instance, of Pennsylvania, they met with the presidential candidates and they decided, yeah, this guy, who's usually guys back then, these days it would be some women too, this guy's okay, this guy knows what he's talking about. Let me give you a little example. So Jack Kennedy in 1960 had to go to Governor Lawrence and meet with him, and you can imagine what that meeting was like. There were probably cigars, there was probably bourbon or whiskey or something, but they had to talk politics and they had to talk government. And obviously, Jack Kennedy was kind of young, right? So people didn't quite know what to expect, whether he was up to it. He had to convince people like Governor Lawrence, who ran a big state, that he kind of knew what he was doing, right? That he kind of knew what he was doing, that he knew what he was doing politically, and he knew what he was doing governmentally. Now, fast forward. Imagine that there's a Governor Lawrence in the state of Pennsylvania who's a Republican, and Donald Trump goes in to meet him. Well, obviously, there's no smoking, right? That's the first change. But imagine Donald Trump sitting down and telling Governor Lawrence, you know what, I'm going to build a wall on the southern border. Governor Lawrence says, okay, that's not a bad idea. And then he says, I'm going to make Mexico pay for it. And Governor Lawrence says, what? Are you crazy? How are you going to do that? You're going to actually invade Mexico to make them pay for a wall? The little Michugana, as some of us would say. So there you go, right? You have that element of peer review that's missing from the nomination system. One of the results is we have all sorts of people running for president who have no business being president, right? It would be disastrous if they were president. And we've eliminated that. So one option here is to have party leaders and elected officials have a greater say in the choice of a nominee through a variety of ways. My favorite option there is to let the governors, the congressmen, the senators, the national committee people give a sort of pre-primary stamp of approval to the presidential candidates, kind of the seal of good housekeeping. The threshold should be low, 15%. You can vote for more than one person, but basically have to go before people who know government and say, yep, this person could be president. And if the threshold was low, you would solve the problem of conservatives or liberals or trying to, doing that. You just keep the threshold low. But you wouldn't have pizza executives. You wouldn't have spiritual advisors, right? You wouldn't have a lot of people who are now running for president, not because they intend to be president, but because they want to sell books or get on television or some other thing. So there you go. Now, what stands in the way of a different option? Well, there's no decider. I call this in one of my books, the problem of the decider. The nomination process today is a combination of actions on the part of 50 state Democratic committees, 50 state Republican committees, 50 state legislatures, the United States Congress, and the Supreme Court. Nobody trumps anybody else in this process. So therefore, you have kind of nobody to make the decision. You have the DNC and the RNC, but remember the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee are composed of state Democratic Party leaders. So it's really the states that are running the show. And so guess what? It's really hard to make change. It's really, and what we have today is we have a system that is left over from the convention system with the primary system placed on top of it. Now, why is this important? And I'll stop in a minute. Why is this important in 2024 as we're going into this nomination contest? It's important because the parties still run the show, even if they've given up a lot of the power they used to have. And so everybody asks me at least once a week or twice a week, oh, Elaine, what happens if one of the candidates drops dead? This is the what if scenario. Or what if one of the candidates goes to jail? We know who we're talking about there. What happens if? Guess what? The convention decides, just like it did in the old days, okay? And those people, those delegates, in modern nominating politics, we think of delegates as the people on the floor wearing funny hats who periodically stand up with signs and they cheer, okay? I've done that. I've been on the floor. You look at your phone and they say, okay, there's like 6 signs there, and they say, okay, next speaker up, hold up this sign, right? And you hold up this sign, etc. We don't do anything, right? Those people, however, if for some reason the convention was composed of people who were freed from their presidential candidate because the presidential candidate dropped dead, went to jail, had a stroke, whatever, guess what? They would decide. Then all of a sudden, being a delegate wouldn't be about waving signs. Being a delegate would be about making real choices for who was going to be nominated at the Democratic or the Republican convention. And by the way, this is the same in both conventions. You would probably have a series of votes preceding the first ballot that would deal with credentials, who got seated, it would deal with the rules of the convention, and it would deal with the platform. And some of those votes would turn into test votes, testing the strength of various people in the race, in the room. But the candidates, the delegates, would actually decide. They would not be television props, which is, most of us are used to the delegates being television props. Those of us who have been delegates, we're used to being television props, right? So there you go. That still is in the hands, ultimately, of the political parties. So while the political parties and the bosses and the elected officials have given up a lot of power since 1968, they still remain the ultimate authority for choosing the nominee of the party. Now, what happens if the nominee of the party, drops dead, goes to jail, whatever, after the convention? The Republican National Committee or the Democratic National Committee, or in this year, who knows, both of them, would call a meeting of their National Committee members. I'm glad somebody's getting my jokes here. So would call a meeting of the National Committee members, and the National Committees would choose the nominee. And that nominee would then run. The ballots wouldn't be changed, but you'd know who was voting for who. They'd figure out a way to do that. They would choose the nominee. If something happened to the president-elect, okay, in a small period of time between Election Day and that second week in December, when the electors meet in their state capitals, that's kind of up in the air, right? Because who knows what would happen? The electors at that point are kind of free agents, right? They've been chosen by their party to go in there. I don't think the electors would vote for somebody in the other party. I mean, they would be the people elected under the Democratic or the Republican ticket, but they would, in fact, maybe make a different choice. And then finally, if something happened to the president-elect, in other words, after the Electoral College has met and there is a president-elect, only at that point does the 20th Amendment to the Constitution kick in. And when it says very clearly that if the president-elect cannot be inaugurated for any reason, he's dead, he's had a stroke, he's behind bars, whatever, then, in fact, the vice president becomes the president. Vice president is inaugurated. So understand this, from now all the way to Election Day, the parties are in charge of this process. This is a party-run process. And many court decisions over the years have reinforced that. The only time the courts go against the parties are when the parties do something that is clearly unconstitutional. And the clearest example of that was in the late 40s. The Texas Democrats decided to have an all-white primary. If you were black, you couldn't vote in the primary, in the Democratic primary. This went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, hey, wait a minute, because in those days, winning the Democratic primary was tantamount to winning the election in Texas. If you were depriving people of voting in the primary, you were depriving them of their 14th Amendment rights to vote. And so that went against the parties. But all other decisions about the parties make, when to hold their primary, whether to allocate delegates, winner take all or proportional, when to have their state conventions, all those things, those have all been tested in the courts. And guess what? The courts say, parties, do what you want to do. Okay? So there you go. The parties, for all of their loss of power, still are ultimately in power if the system has unexpected outcomes. And it doesn't have to be the death of somebody. It could be you have a primary season where 3 candidates are running, and somebody gets 40%, and somebody gets 40%, and somebody gets 20%, right? So and nobody beats 50%. The parties end up being the chooser. And it's very hard to get us a different way of doing this for the reason I spoke about before. There's no decider. There's no decider. This is ultimately in the hands of parties, and the parties are ultimately in the hands of their state parties. And the state legislatures mix it up a little bit. They apportion money, et cetera, to run the primaries. But the bottom line is this is in the hands of the parties, and getting 50 Democratic parties and 50 Republican parties to agree on something, pretty impossible. So there you go. Let's have some questions.
Questions? Sure.
Thank you, Elaine. You mentioned early on about the states jockeying for position in the primaries, and you're in Nevada,
Yep.
where a lot of people have spent a lot of time trying to get Nevada into that process, and we just did. I think it might be fair to say both parties dropped the ball a little bit in how that turned out. Of course, we had 2 presumptive nominees. Maybe that had something to do with it. But as someone who's not from Nevada, do we matter?
Well, you didn't matter this time, okay? Didn't matter this time. But that doesn't mean you won't matter the next time. So in 2028, the Democrats will have, you know, if whether Biden wins or loses, right? In 2028, there's going to be a big primary in Nevada. And, you know, you might have a big you'll almost certainly have a big Democratic primary because you won't have an incumbent president, and you'll probably have a Republican primary too. Or the Republicans could choose to use a caucus, but my guess is that without a frontrunner like Trump, they will have a primary too, because they'll want the attention, they'll want the expansion of the electorate that comes with the primary. So just because it didn't matter this time doesn't matter. You should give up the fight. It's going to matter. The Democratic Party spent a long time, and then the Republican Party agreed, saying Nevada, we should have a Western state go first. It should be a smallish state. And it should have, for the Democrats, it should have a lot of Hispanic voters, and it should have a lot of union voters. So Nevada fit that bill. I think it'll continue to fit that bill. And I think you're just going to have to wait a couple years.
So, would you be able to describe how your proposed solution, which you said is having party leaders be able to interview these candidates, how does that compare and contrast to the superdelegates as the Democrats currently have it, and in what way do you see that happening? And correct me if I'm wrong, this is in a way to create a type of hybrid system in order to help screen but also have a form of democracy.
Yeah, it would, in fact, create a hybrid system, right, where you'd have some input from superdelegates, so-called superdelegates, and you'd have and then you'd have input from the primary voters. The thing about the superdelegates, and I'm one of them, is that we basically don't ever exercise our discretion, right? We're people who know a lot about this. I spent 4 years in the White House seeing the President of the United States every other day or so. I think I know something about the presidency, right? But all we do is we just sort of follow who's winning in the primaries, and then the superdelegates say, yeah, that guy won the most votes, and so I'm going to be for him. And what you miss is the evaluation component of it. And that's what the primary voters can't do, okay? The primary voters don't know enough to know. I mean, I'll give you, there was a certain presidential candidate who in a debate was asked a question about the nuclear triad. This candidate clearly did not know what it is. Now, most people in America don't know what it is, but it is our defense against a long-range nuclear attack from Russia to the United States. And it consists of submarines constantly ready to intercept, B-52 bombers flying all the time, by the way, they're flying all the time to intercept, and land-based ICM missiles. That's our protection against annihilation. It's pretty important. What you think about it is pretty important. What you do with it in the future is pretty important. To have a presidential candidate who does not know what it is, okay, that's a problem. And that's why the one option that I put there is to have United States senators sit down with the presidential candidates. And if there was, say, you needed 15% of the vote to get the stamp of approval, oh yeah, that guy knows what he's talking about, that woman knows what she's talking about, that person, then fine, right? In some years, they'd probably approve all of them. But in some years, they'd find somebody who doesn't know what that is. That's not good. That's not good. So the superdelegates kind of follow along with the primaries. And most of the time, and they've never, there's a lot of fear that they would, but they've never contradicted the voters in the primaries. And so this is a little bit more than that.
Thanks a lot. Towards the end there, you talked about what could happen between Election Day and Inauguration Day. And I've spent a lot of time thinking too much procedurally on what could have happened on January 6th that would have changed what happened on Inauguration Day. What actually could have happened?
Not anything. Nothing could have happened. And the reason is that the Constitution makes it clear that the certificates of ascertainment, which are the certificates the electors in each state capital sign, right, go to the President of the Senate, who is the Vice President of the United States, and he opens them and he counts them. That's it. So, Pence understood this. Everybody, most of the people in the Congress understood this. What they were trying to do was, on January 6th, is inject an element of uncertainty in there so that they could buy for time and maybe get this thing thrown into the House as a contingent election. The problem was the Electoral College had spoken. It had already spoken. It had spoken in December in state legislatures. They had signed the official papers. There was no way to undo that. These fake electors that people, got up, they didn't sign the papers, right? They signed fake papers. This was all done ahead of time. So January 6th was really a riot. It was really a riot, and the intention was to cause confusion, disruption, and doubt, right? Doubt in people's minds, in the hopes that somehow the House of Representatives could change this around. The Congress recently passed, not recently, early in Biden's term, both parties passed a bipartisan bill called the Electoral Count Act, which removes any ambiguity at all from the role of the vice president. So the vice president's role is simply to count. It is not to decide that these electors are legitimate and these aren't. It's simply to count. So I don't think, in fact, it was interesting, I heard a Republican the other day, somebody asked him, if Trump loses, will we see a repeat of this? And he said, no, I don't think we'll see a repeat of January 6th. And the reason was, A, it's clear what the law is, and B, a lot of people went to jail and are now having to pay for lawyers. They're in jail, they've been prosecuted, et cetera. I'll give you a little example from Washington, which is January 6th happens, and then the rumor went around on the internet that, on March 4th, which is the traditional inauguration day, everybody's gonna come back and they're gonna storm the Capitol and fight for Trump. Well, the National Guard, the Washington police, everybody got all riled up. The entire town, right? You couldn't even drive anyplace because the entire town had streets blocked off, fences, et cetera. March 4th comes along, there are men in riot gear all over the place and machine guns and everything, all over the place. Nobody came. Nobody showed up. No rioters showed up. No protesters. There wasn't even a protester. No one came. What had happened between January 6th and March the 4th? People were going to jail. People were being prosecuted. Okay, the patriots, as Trump calls them, FBI was knocking on their door saying, hey, we've got videotape of you smashing a window in the United States Congress, breaking down a door into Speaker Pelosi's office. These are crimes, and you will get prosecuted for it. So I actually don't think it'll happen again. And it was interesting to hear Republicans say that, who are closer to that wing of the party. Others?
Earlier you mentioned that one of the central issues is that, when you brought up that candidate that didn't know about the nuclear triad, and it's most voters don't even know about it. Is it a super utopian solution to try to deal with that through education, making voters be the ones who self-regulate and see is this person should they even be president?
Well, that's an interesting question. Voters have other things to do than to pay attention to policy, right? The woman who is the maid of honor in my daughter's wedding is a pediatric cardiologist, right? She does amazing things. She fixes babies' hearts in utero, right? She is so oblivious to current affairs. I can't tell you. She just doesn't know. On the other hand, she can fix babies' hearts. I'm impressed. I can't do that, right? So there's a lot of people who, and this is where political parties come in, they're a shorthand. right? It's a shorthand for understanding politics. If you're doing something else, sometimes more important, if you're doing something else and you're not paying attention to every issue that comes down the road. And voters tend to, they have a political party or predisposition. So if you're in business and you don't like all these regulations and you don't like all these taxes and you're constantly thinking it's unfair, you're probably going to vote Republican, whether you know anything about the issues of the day or not. If you are a social worker and you see people in need all the time and you want the government to help them, et cetera, you're probably a Democrat. And we have these broad ideas. Then it comes to the question of judging competence. That is very hard for voters to do because, as you said, they don't know these issues in and out. And that's where we miss peer review, because there's nobody to separate out people who know things, who theoretically could do the job, from people who really, frankly, can't do the job. And you don't want, all the fuss about the deep state, right? And there's this deep state out there that'll control everything. The dumber your president is, the dumber your United States senators and congressmen are, the more power resides in the deep state that is not elected by anybody. So that's where you get real trouble. You want your elected officials to know something. And if you want to control the government, and this is where the Republicans kind of run off the rails here, if you want to control government power, you want people who understand what it is and how it's exercised. And that's where peer review comes in. And again, I'm not saying kick the primary voters out. I'm saying we have peer review in everything else we do, and we've lost it in our presidential campaigns.
Elaine, you spoke during the lecture about the importance of momentum and how it can be sometimes more important than cash.
Yeah.
But cash is important.
Yeah, cash
and
is important.
the amount of money that is in our current presidential election system is enormous. Billions of dollars are spent. Is the single national primary day the best way to reduce the amount of spending that has to take place through the primaries and caucuses to even get on the ballot? Or are there other ways to sort of campaign finance our way to a better route?
Nothing will really reduce it, I hate to say, okay? Nothing is really going to reduce the importance of money. And I'm not worried about spending money, about the billions spent. How much do we spend on lipstick in America? It's a lot of money, okay? How much do we spend on wine in America? It's a lot of money. What does a campaign do? A campaign educates people. They fight people, the candidates fight over things. They're not very deep in the weeds on issues, but there's some of them, right? They'll fight about Medicare, they'll fight about the defense budget, et cetera, et cetera. It's the one time every 4 years that everybody tunes in and says, oh, okay, they learned something. So I'm all in favor of voters learning something, even if it's once every 4 years. And if you limit money, you're gonna limit the learning. Now, there are some other ways to help even the playing field. In some countries, England and Israel, they have free television for a period of time, okay? And the candidates get free TV depending on their party's portion of the vote in the last election. So the big parties get the most, but the smaller parties get some airtime too. So free television has always been a good way to do it. The momentum for campaign finance reform really slowed with the internet because it doesn't take a lot of money to get on the internet. It doesn't take a lot of money to do social media. You need a compelling message, for sure. You need some kind of national, vision and some kind of national standing, but it doesn't really take money. So I just don't think there's going to be anything done about this in the near future.
I read your article on how 10,000 people could actually win the election. Once the election usually happens, the media usually talks about how like the popular vote is different from the electoral college.
Right.
What's your opinion on the popular vote?
Well, it's a big problem, okay? So let's do a little bit of history. For most of American history, up until the 1920s, when we admitted a new state to the Union, we simply increased the size of Congress, right? You got a couple more congressmen. In the 1921, I think it was, you'd have to check me on this, Congress capped the House of Representatives at 435 people. But every state had to have at least one member of Congress. So we now have a situation where, because of that cap, the size of, and I may get my numbers a little bit wrong, but the average size of a congressional district in California is 1.7 million. And the size of the Wyoming congressional district is about 500,000. You see the distortion right there. And the distortion comes from the capping. So all these little states, North Dakota has one, right? It also comes from the addition of the senators into the Electoral College. So again, as a way of holding the Union together and creating the Union in the first place, right, everybody had to, all the states had to have 2 senators, even the teeny little ones and the great big ones. In those days, the big ones were Massachusetts and Virginia, but there were plenty of small ones. Well, that's a distortion too. Take Wyoming, I hate to you know, keep harping on Wyoming, but Wyoming has 3 electoral votes. They have no people. They have more sheep than people in Wyoming. Where are the people? They're in this order: California, Texas, New York, Illinois. And so what we've got is a real weird situation here that we didn't have for much of history. The second thing that contributes to this, which is you're going to think is very odd, is the agricultural revolution. So for most of our history, the farm states had a fair number of people in them because you needed a fair number of people to farm. Agricultural revolution comes along, and we now feed the entire world with like no people, right? Even farming is massive, it's corporatized, it's machines doing everything. So where's the population gone? Well, it's gone to the coast, right? It's spread out a little bit in Texas, some in Illinois and the Midwest, but basically, you know, we don't have farmers every place. We used to have farmers every place, and so you had a more even distribution of the population. This leaves us with a big problem, right? Which is that some states with few people have a lot more influence than states with a lot of people. What can we do about it? Well, not much, because it's in the Constitution, and we are unlikely to, open up the Constitution for reform. However, there's one option. It's the only option that's ever been thought of. States do not have to award their electors on the basis of winner take all, which is what all but 2 states do now. You know, you win the presidential race in the state, and you get all the electors. You could, in fact, give those electors to the winner of the popular vote nationally. And there's something called the Electoral Compact, which is passed in enough state legislatures to account for 193 electoral votes. And of course, you need 270. If they ever got to 270, the compact would go into effect, and those 270 electoral votes would be awarded automatically, not to the winner of the state, but to the winner of the national popular vote. As you can imagine, Democrats like this, Republicans don't. Republicans, and it's no accident that in our lifetimes there have been 2 elections where the electoral vote winner got fewer than the popular vote. One of them I was in, the Al Gore election in 2000. You know, he had a 600,000 vote margin nationally over Bush. Most of that, guess where it came from? California. And then if you look at Hillary versus Trump, same thing. Hillary had an even bigger popular vote margin, huge amount of this coming from California. Okay? Californians should be madder about this than they are. I'm not quite sure why they're not madder than this, but the very reason we can't fix it is the very reason it arose in the first place, which is the small states want their power. They want to keep their power. So imagine this proposition in the United States Senate. All the small states would vote against it. So there you go. We're kind of stuck. I am hoping that at some point the electoral vote compact would work and would get us out of this rut. But we're in a real mess here because the Democratic vote has to be much, much bigger to win the Electoral College vote than the Republican vote. And, you know, it just is not, I think, what people think is fair in a democracy.
Please join me in thanking Elaine for this lecture tonight. As promised at the beginning, if you have any lingering questions, Elaine will stay for just a few minutes to help answer those. Before you all leave, I want to also take a moment to encourage you in marking your calendars for our next talk in the Brookings Scholar Lecture Series this spring. It will take place on Wednesday, March 20th, so a bit of ways from now, 6 p.m. here in Greenspun Hall Auditorium. We're welcoming back our colleague, Erin Klein, who's actually formerly served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the U.S. Department of Treasury. Erin will be giving us an interesting talk that evening about payment systems as a tool for public policy. So we'll hope you'll be able to attend that as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.